Adrien and Julian Sinclair were born into a world of privilege, beauty, and power, sons of an influential family with unimaginable wealth. The twins, however, were more than just heirs to their family's fortune. From a young age, they were known as the Golden Twins for their striking appearance and the nearly magical bond they seemed to share. With their flawless features, shimmering golden hair, and intense blue eyes, the world couldn't help but be captivated by them. Wherever they went, heads turned. People spoke in hushed tones about their beauty and grace, their synchronized movements, and their uncanny ability to finish each other's sentences. But it wasn't just their appearance that set them apart. Adrien and Julian had a connection that was deeper than anything anyone around them had ever seen. It went beyond the normal twin bond. They shared not only looks, but also thoughts, emotions, and desires. It was as if they were two halves of the same soul, destined to be forever entwined in each other's lives. Their parents, distant and more concerned with their business empire than their sons, left them largely to their own devices, raising them in a lavish world without boundaries or restrictions. Growing up in the family's penthouse, a towering, glass-encased sanctuary overlooking the glittering skyline of New York City, their lives were filled with luxury and excess. They attended the finest schools, mingled with high society, and never lacked for anything. Yet, despite all the attention they received from the outside world, Adrien and Julian remained insulated, wrapped in the cocoon of their unique bond. They were each other's everything, best friends, confidants, protectors. No one else could understand them the way they understood each other, and no one else mattered quite as much. As they grew older, their bond deepened. They became more isolated from the world outside their twin dynamic, which only intensified the connection between them. Julian, the more sensitive and introspective of the two, always seemed to follow Adrien's lead. Adrien, confident and decisive, was the twin with the stronger will, the one who made decisions, the one who always seemed to know what was best for both of them. Together, they created their own universe, where only they existed, and everything outside was just background noise. People often remarked on how close the twins were, how inseparable they seemed, and how no one could ever come between them. But as they moved into adulthood, something darker began to emerge from their bond. A secret that neither of them fully understood at first, but that would soon consume them both. On a warm summer evening on June 23rd, 2019, something changed between Adrien and Julian. They had spent the day at a high-profile charity event, another in a long line of glamorous functions where they were expected to charm, smile, and play the perfect roles their family demanded of them. But beneath the polished veneer, tension simmered between the twins. Julian had been more distant lately, as if something was troubling him, but he refused to talk about it. Adrien, sensing his brother's growing withdrawal, had grown frustrated. After the event, they returned to the penthouse, both still dressed in their designer suits, the city's lights twinkling far below them. The air was thick with the humid warmth of summer, and the silence between them was almost suffocating. Julian had been quiet all evening, his mind elsewhere. He stood by the large glass windows, staring out at the skyline, lost in thought. Adrien, always the one to break the silence, approached him, his steps slow and deliberate. He could feel the tension radiating off his brother, and it bothered him more than he wanted to admit. "Julian," Adrien said softly, his voice a gentle command. "What's wrong?" Julian didn't turn to face him, but Adrien could see the conflict in his brother's reflection in the glass. His jaw was tense, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. It wasn't like Julian to be so closed off, especially from Adrien. They had always shared everything, every thought, every emotion. But now, something was different. "I don't know," Julian murmured after a long pause, his voice barely audible. "I just feel confused." Adrien stepped closer, his frustration giving way to concern. He hated seeing Julian like this, so unsure of himself, so lost. Adrien had always been the stronger one, the one who knew how to guide them both. He reached out and placed a hand on Julian's shoulder, hoping to ground him, to remind him of their connection. The touch was meant to be comforting, but the moment Adrien's hand met Julian's shoulder, something shifted between them. It was as if an invisible line had been crossed, a barrier broken that neither of them had realized was there. Julian turned his head slightly, his eyes meeting Adrian's in the reflection. The air between them seemed to thicken, charged with an intensity that neither of them understood. Adrian's hand lingered on Julian's shoulder for longer than it should have, his fingers gripping just a little too tightly. Julian felt a strange pull in his chest, a sensation he couldn't explain. A longing, a need that was both familiar and terrifying. His heart raced as he finally turned to face Adrian fully. There was a moment of silence, a breathless pause where time seemed to stand still. They were standing so close now, closer than they had ever been before, in a way that felt different, dangerous. Adrian's eyes searched Julian's face, looking for something, an answer, perhaps, or permission. And then, without thinking, Adrian reached out with his other hand and gently cupped Julian's face. His touch was soft but firm, and Julian didn't pull away. Instead, he leaned into it, his breath hitching as his heart pounded in his chest. Adrian's thumb brushed against Julian's cheek, and the sensation sent a jolt of electricity through both of them. This wasn't how brothers were supposed to touch, how they were supposed to look at each other. But in that moment, it didn't matter. Nothing mattered except the heat between them, the overwhelming connection that neither of them could deny any longer. "I can't lose you," Adrien whispered, his voice rough with emotion. Julian's eyes flickered with something that looked like fear, but he didn't move. He didn't break away from Adrian's touch. Instead, he stood frozen, caught between the love he had always known and the new, confusing feelings that were threatening to consume him. "I'm not going anywhere," Julian whispered back, though his voice wavered. But they both knew it wasn't that simple anymore. Something had changed, and there was no going back. And then, without warning, Adrien leaned in. It wasn't a kiss, not quite, but their foreheads pressed together, their breaths mingling as they stood there, caught in the tension of a moment they didn't fully understand. The first touch had happened, and there was no undoing it. In that instant, their relationship shifted into something far more dangerous than they could have ever anticipated. The bond that had always united them was now a double-edged sword, and neither of them knew where this new path would lead. But one thing was certain: they couldn't stop now. After that fateful night when Adrien and Julian first crossed the line, their relationship took a dark and intoxicating turn. What began as a forbidden touch spiraled into something far more intense, something they couldn't control. Their love affair, driven by the thrill of secrecy and the excitement of crossing boundaries, became their entire world. Yet underneath it all, they knew the truth. What they were doing was wrong. Society would never accept it, and their family's reputation would be destroyed if the truth ever came out. Each night, when the world went quiet, Adrien would slip into Julian's room, or Julian would sneak into Adrien's. The house was filled with secrets, and they thrived in the darkness of their forbidden love. The risk was exhilarating. Their hands would explore each other in the dim light, and every kiss, every intimate moment was charged with the tension of knowing they could be caught at any moment. The act of sneaking around, of stealing time to be together, only made their bond stronger. The more dangerous their love became, the deeper they sank into it. They would lie in each other's arms, whispering promises they knew they couldn't keep, plans for a future together where no one could judge them. It was a fantasy, but one they clung to desperately. The affair became more than just physical. It was an emotional entanglement neither of them could escape. Adrien, always the more dominant of the two, was intoxicated by the power he had over Julian. He loved the way Julian would melt under his touch, the way his twin would give himself completely. It made Adrien feel invincible, as though nothing could tear them apart. Julian, on the other hand, was torn. He craved Adrien's love, his attention, but with each passing day, the guilt gnawed at him. The weight of their secret was becoming unbearable, and he began to feel trapped, suffocated by the relationship that had once made him feel so alive. Their love was not just dangerous because of the moral taboo, it was becoming toxic. The boundaries between right and wrong blurred with every touch, and soon both brothers were caught in a web of lies, deceit, and a deep-seated jealousy that began to rear its ugly head. Their relationship was no longer just about love, it was about possession, about control. And then came the summer night that changed everything. a night that would haunt them forever. Chloe Martinez was a childhood friend of the Sinclairs, a vibrant girl who had always admired the twins from afar. She was beautiful, with flowing dark hair and an infectious laugh. She had once been a part of their world, but as they grew older, she faded into the background. She was a constant reminder of the lives they used to lead before their world became consumed by secrets. On July 30th, 2019, Adrien and Julian found themselves at a party hosted by one of their family's business partners in the Hamptons. The opulence of the mansion, the clinking of glasses, and the laughter of the elite surrounded them. But neither brother was in the mood to socialize. They were still reeling from the intensity of their last encounter, their minds clouded with a mix of excitement and guilt. But then Chloe entered the room. Dressed in a stunning emerald green gown, she lit up the party, her presence commanding attention. Adrien couldn't help but stare, and for a moment Julian felt a pang of jealousy watching his brother's eyes linger on her. It was a reminder of everything that had changed, a reminder of what could never be. Chloe approached them, her smile wide and genuine. "Hey, you two, it's been so long," she exclaimed, her eyes sparkling. "You both look amazing. I've missed you guys." Adrien flashed her a charming smile, but Julian felt a sense of dread wash over him. Chloe was a sweet girl, but she represented a world they could no longer be a part of. The guilt and anxiety bubbled to the surface as Adrien and Chloe chatted, laughter ringing in Julian's ears like a death knell. Later that night, as the party raged on, Julian retreated to a secluded balcony, needing a moment to clear his head. He leaned against the railing, looking out at the dark ocean, the moon casting shimmering reflections on the waves. But he wasn't alone for long. Chloe found him, her hair blowing in the ocean breeze as she stepped outside. "Hey," she said softly, her voice breaking the silence. "You okay?" Julian forced a smile, trying to hide his turmoil. "Yeah, just needed some air." Chloe leaned against the railing next to him, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "You and Adrien seem really close these days. I haven't seen you both like this since we were kids." Julian's heart raced. "Yeah, well, things change," he replied, avoiding her eyes. He could feel the weight of the secret pressing down on him, and he didn't know how to respond. I've missed you both. It feels like I lost my best friends," Chloe said, her voice tinged with sadness. Julian felt a pang of guilt. He didn't want to hurt her, but he didn't know how to explain the distance that had grown between them. "We're still here," he said softly. Suddenly, there was a commotion coming from inside the mansion, a loud crash followed by raised voices. Julian's heart sank as he recognized Adrien's voice rising above the chaos. "Get your hands off her," Adrien shouted. Julian's instinct kicked in, and he rushed back inside, with Chloe right behind him. The scene that unfolded was shocking. In the center of the lavish living room, Adrien stood face to face with a young man, his fists clenched, eyes blazing. The tension in the room was electric, everyone else standing back in shock. "What the hell is going on?" Julian demanded, pushing through the crowd. Adrien's eyes snapped to Julian, filled with fury. "He touched her. I swear, Julian, I won't let him hurt her." In that moment, everything escalated. The man, furious at being called out, swung at Adrien. The blow landed hard, knocking Adrien back, and in that split second, the atmosphere shifted. Julian felt a surge of protectiveness as he rushed forward, grabbing the man and pulling him away from Adrien. The confrontation spiraled out of control. The crowd gasped, shouting for someone to break it up. Julian, fueled by adrenaline, pushed the man back. "Stay away from him," he shouted, the fury bubbling to the surface. But then, in the chaos, everything happened so fast. The young man pulled out a knife, a glint of silver in the dim light, and in a shocking instant, he lunged at Adrien, aiming straight for his brother. "Adrien!" Julian screamed, panic coursing through him. He lunged forward, but it was too late. The blade found its mark, and Adrien fell to the floor, gasping for breath. Chaos erupted. People screamed, some rushing to call for help, while others stepped back in horror. Julian knelt beside Adrien, his heart pounding in his chest. "Adrien, no, no, no," he cried, cradling his brother's head in his hands. "Stay with me, please." As the sirens wailed in the distance, Julian felt the world around him fade away. All that mattered was Adrien, and the horror of what had just happened. In the chaos, Chloe stood frozen, her eyes wide with shock. She hadn't realized the depth of the bond between the twins until that moment, but the sight of Adrien bleeding out on the floor ignited something in her, a determination to fight for the truth. The police arrived moments later, led by Detective Sarah Thompson, a seasoned officer known for her no-nonsense approach. As she assessed the scene, her gaze fell on Julian and Adrien, a mix of urgency and compassion in her eyes. "Get an ambulance," she shouted to her team, kneeling beside Julian. "What happened here?" He just... He attacked him," Julian stammered, tears streaming down his face. "He was trying to hurt Chloe." Detective Thompson's expression hardened as she glanced at Chloe, who was shaking, trying to process the nightmare unfolding before her. "And you? What's your name?" she asked Chloe. "Chloe Martinez," she replied, her voice trembling. "I didn't know. He just came out of nowhere." As the paramedics arrived and rushed Adrien to the hospital, Julian felt like his world was crumbling. He clung to the hope that his brother would survive, but as they wheeled Adrien away, the reality of the situation hit him like a cold wave. Hours passed in the hospital, the sterile smell of antiseptic mingling with the tension in the air. Detective Thompson took their statements, her gaze sharp and focused. She seemed to see through their pain, recognizing the unspoken bond that lay between the twins. "Is he going to be okay?" Julian finally managed to ask, his voice cracking. Detective Thompson glanced at the emergency room doors, her expression inscrutable. "We'll do everything we can," she promised, though Julian could hear the underlying worry in her tone. The minutes turned into hours, and as the night deepened, a sense of foreboding settled over Julian. He couldn't shake the feeling that everything was unraveling. Chloe sat beside him, her hand resting on his, offering silent support. They both stared at the door, waiting for any news about Adrien. But when the doctor finally emerged, his face was grave. "I'm sorry," he said, and those two words shattered Julian's world. "We did everything we could, but he didn't make it." Julian's heart dropped, a heavy weight crushing his chest. He felt like he was drowning in grief, and the walls of the hospital seemed to close in around him. He could barely breathe. Chloe gasped, her hand covering her mouth as she processed the news. "No, no, no!" Julian cried, stumbling back, as if he could distance himself from the pain. "This can't be happening." Detective Thompson placed a hand on his shoulder, her expression softening. "We'll get justice for him, I promise," she said, her voice steady. But as Julian stood there, grappling with the loss of his brother, he couldn't help but wonder about the price of their love. The terrible, tragic cost of a bond that had been beautiful and dark all at once. Months passed, and the case went to trial. The courtroom was filled with tension, the air thick with sorrow and anticipation. Julian sat beside Chloe, their hands clasped tightly together as they faced the man who had taken Adrien's life. Detective Sarah Thompson stood at the front, presenting the evidence against the accused, a man who had turned into a symbol of the chaos that had upended their lives. The courtroom was filled with family, friends, and strangers, all waiting for justice to be served. As the judge, Emily Carter, took her seat, silence enveloped the room. The gavel struck, and the trial began. Witness after witness testified, painting a picture of that tragic night. Chloe spoke about the moments leading up to the attack, her voice trembling as she recounted how she had felt helpless. Julian could barely hold himself together as he listened to the recounting of the last moments he had with Adrien. When it was finally his turn to take the stand, Julian felt like he was in a daze. He recounted everything: the love, the secret, the chaos of that night. "My brother was everything to me," he said, his voice cracking under the weight of grief. "He didn't deserve this. He was just trying to protect Chloe." Detective Thompson presented the final evidence, a damning piece that linked the accused to the crime. As the jury deliberated, Julian sat in a haze, desperately clinging to hope that justice would prevail. Finally, the verdict came down. "We, the jury, find the defendant guilty of murder in the second degree," the foreman announced. A wave of relief washed over Julian, though it was tinged with sorrow. As the gavel struck once more, signaling the end of the trial, Julian felt a strange sense of closure wash over him. He had fought for his brother, for their love, and now, despite the pain, he could finally breathe again. Chloe squeezed his hand, her eyes filled with unshed tears. "We did it," she whispered, though the victory felt hollow. Julian nodded, still feeling the weight of Adrian's absence, but he knew he would carry his brother's spirit with him forever. The love they had shared was now a bittersweet memory, a reminder of the beauty and tragedy of their connection. As he stepped out of the courtroom, he felt the sun on his face for the first time in months, a reminder that life would go on, even in the aftermath of such profound loss. But the golden memories of Adrien would forever remain etched in his heart, a tragic reminder of their bond that had transcended everything. Thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit that like button. Your support means a lot to us. And if you want to see more content like this, be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. We love hearing from you, so drop a comment below with your thoughts or suggestions for future videos. Until next time, keep exploring and stay curious.